Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Hands Where I Can See Them, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by FlyingBlueBirds, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Britt. Hands Where I Can See Them. Chapter 18. Enough. Tally knew she was technically still off the Camarilla case. Spending the night with Sarah might have changed a lot, but nothing on that matter. Still, once Sarah had finished her call and started to gather her clothes, that were spread all over the floor, Tally was out of bed within seconds. She quickly joined Sarah in getting dressed, and to her surprise, her partner didn't try to stop her. Until then, they still hadn't spoken a single word. There seemed to be an unspoken agreement hanging in the air between them. One that made clear that Tally would not let Sarah go on her own, no matter how much she wanted to. And at that moment, Sarah apparently knew better than to test her limits. So when Tally got into her car not even 10 minutes later, Sarah wordlessly dropped down onto the passenger seat next to her. Still, the silence between them wasn't a comfortable one. That call had effortlessly busted the already fragile bubble of safety they had created for themselves in those last hours. Tally hated how much she had clung onto that string of hope that everything was over, that everything would be all right, that Sarah was finally getting some of the peace and quiet she was so desperately craving. But something about this had felt off from the moment Kara Brand had been arrested. She was absolutely certain it was her voice she had heard, would pledge under oath that she was the woman who had kidnapped her. Still, there were too many pieces of the puzzle missing. She should have trusted her gut, should have listened to her inner voice, that nagging doubt that all of this had seemed a little bit too good to be true, a little bit too easy to be the solution. But then there had been Sarah. Scathing, stubborn, selfless Sarah, standing in front of her door, pouring her heart out, making Tally forget everything she thought she knew. Her lips, her hands, her everything. Everything that she had desired for so long, and that had still hit her completely unprepared. And now she was falling. Oh, she was falling so fast. So fast that Tally had no control over it anymore. It was on Sarah to catch her, to ground her and steady her pace. Tally just wasn't sure if she could. In fact, the whole car ride was giving Tally flashbacks, a terrible sense of déjà vu, bringing back so many memories she would rather forget. Sarah and Tally getting interrupted, Sarah being all tense and distant, the two of them arguing, Sarah shutting Tally out, and Tally forgetting all of her common sense in response, running straight into the arms of a serial killer. She didn't dare to turn her eyes away from the road. She didn't dare to talk to Sarah. She didn't even dare to look at her. Too afraid of what she would spot on her face. Too afraid of the rejection she would receive. Again. She knew the words that Sarah had said to her last night had been true, and that she had meant every word of it. She had felt it in every touch, had heard it in every breath whisper, and she had savored each and every moment of it. But Tally also knew Sarah. Her impulses would tell her to draw all of her walls back up, to shut Tally out, and pretend that the night between them had never happened in the first place. The day had never happened in the first place. It was what she always did. It was what she had done before. And at that moment, Tally was absolutely terrified that she would do it again. Later, she could barely recall parking the car, a bit away from the scene, not quite ready for the hectic chaos that was awaiting them. She was too busy spiraling, too lost in her own anxious thoughts to pay much attention to anything else. Once she had turned off the engine, she was so busy fidgeting with the car keys that she couldn't stop a small, surprised gasp from escaping her mouth when it was in fact Sarah who was breaking the silence between them. "Tally?" Her voice was uncertain, shaking slightly, pausing for a moment. But Tally already knew what would be coming next, and she couldn't deal with that right now. So she interrupted Sarah before she could finish her sentence. "It's okay. I understand." And she did. She truly did. But it still hurt like hell. She needed some space, needed to get out of that car. The space between them suddenly felt too tight, like it was suffocating her. She could feel Sarah wanted to add something that would very likely result in Tally showing up at a crime scene like a complete mess once again, and that absolutely couldn't happen. So without waiting another moment, she pushed the car door open and stepped into the cool morning air, hoping it would clear her mind and make breathing a little bit easier. It didn't. Not in the slightest. But she needed to move, needed to get away from all of this, and so Tally started to walk. She could hear Sarah getting out of the car right behind her, following her with quick steps, but she didn't turn around. Not when she heard Sarah quietly whispering her name, not when she felt her slowly catching up, not until she could feel Sarah's hand on her arm. A touch that was meant to be gentle and caring, but shot through her body like electricity, and was almost enough to break Tally completely. "Tally, wait." Sarah's voice sounded firmer now, and it was more of a subconscious reaction than a conscious decision when Tally finally stopped walking. Anything inside of her screamed at her to keep going, and she knew that she should. She really should. But instead, she turned around, her lips pressed together in a thin line, her eyes drawn to the ground, not willing to show anything else than complete indifference, a constructed facade that Sarah had taught her all too well. But Sarah's hand was still lying on her arm, and Tally hated how much her own body was betraying her, hated how she was leaning into the touch, hated how her stomach flipped when she felt the fingers of Sarah's other hand moving up to her face, softly stroking her cheek, wandering down her face, and gently lifting up her chin. Hated how she wasn't able to swallow down the tears that were prickling in her eyes when she was met by ice-blue orbs filled with uncertainty and doubt, but also a certain fire that Tally hadn't expected to see. "I know I've messed this up before." Sarah slowly let her hand wander over Tally's arm, over the back of her own hand, intertwining their fingers. "This is a lot to take. Not only for me, but for all of us. And I am not really sure what this means, how this happened, but I need you to trust me one last time. Even though so far I've done barely anything to earn it. I need you to give me a chance to deal with this. Because I will, Tally. I will deal with this, no matter how hard it is going to be. I am not pushing you away again. I want this. I want us." Tally blinked once, twice, certain that she must have misheard. "You do?" she whispered quietly, as if speaking up would make Sarah realize what she had just said, and would make her take back her words in an instant. But when Sarah only smiled at her softly and carefully stepped closer, not a glimpse of doubt left on her face, Tally's breath hitched, and a relief that was entirely inappropriate, considering a murder victim was waiting for them only a couple of 100 meters away, was starting to spread through her body. In fact, I don't think I ever wanted something so much. Sarah leaned forward so that her forehead was now resting against Tally's. With their hands still intertwined, neither of them moved for a moment. Tally knew she wasn't going to kiss her. Not here. Not with all of their colleagues only a stone's throw away. But she didn't have to. Her body language spoke for itself. Tally closed her eyes and simply enjoyed being so close to Sarah, being with Sarah, being wanted by Sarah. The horrors that would be awaiting them were still very much present in her head, but paired with it was a strange comfort that made her feel calmer than she had in weeks. And for the first time, Tally Craven realized that she might finally be enough. After a while, though, the moment was over and the sound of police sirens ruggedly pulled them back into reality. Sarah stepped away from Tally and cleared her throat. I guess that's our cue. There's no turning back now, she smiled grimly. No, I guess there isn't, Tally replied, immediately missing the warmth that Sarah's body had radiated, and the security that had come with it. They both took one last deep breath, braced themselves, then started to walk towards the crime scene. With every step towards the blue flashing lights of the sirens, Tally felt a bit more of her calmness washing away. Instead, her chest tightened, and an uncomfortable feeling was dwelling up in her stomach once more. She knew she had to be professional, but everything inside her screamed to reach out and take Sarah's hand into her own. She didn't. Of course not. No matter how much it would help her still growing anxiety. But just when her discomfort had reached its peak, she felt the soft pressure of Sarah's hand on her lower back. It was a subtle movement. She was barely touching her, just casually guiding her along the way. But almost immediately, Tally felt some of the pressure being lifted off of her. Sarah was here, with her, and they would get through this, together. Just as Tally had expected, Detective Batten and Captain Bellwether were already waiting for them. Well, waiting for Sarah, technically. But neither of the two women even bat an eye when Sarah and Tally arrived together like it was the most natural thing in the world. Still, Tally didn't miss the knowing smirk that was appearing on Nicta's face when she mustered Sarah, and of course didn't miss that she was still wearing the exact same clothes she had been wearing yesterday. What she hadn't expected, however, was that another familiar face was accompanying Batten and Bellwether. Someone Tally had definitely not wanted to see again anytime soon, and that looked totally out of place in this overly expensive designer suit and his shiny leather shoes. Director Silver. Sarah's cold voice was cutting through the chilly morning air like a knife. To what do we owe this pleasure? Then she turned her head towards Detective Batten, and the look Tally spotted on her face made the actual intent of her words perfectly clear and mirrored exactly what Tally was thinking. What the hell is this fucker doing here? Batten only shrugged in response, and the look that Captain Bellwether gave them was almost apologetical. Detective Alder, the pleasure is all mine. Silver himself clearly didn't get the memo and gave Sarah a bright smile, and oh, how Tally wanted to punch it off of his face. Then his eyes moved over to Tally, lingering for a moment too long on Sarah's hand that was still casually placed on Tally's lower back, and his mouth twisted slightly. And I see you've brought the redhead again. Craven, was it? It's Detective Craven to you, Tally replied without missing a beat, returning his calculated smile. Of course. Silver's smile didn't falter once, but something in his intense gaze made Tally shiver involuntarily. But she wouldn't back down, and she didn't. Still, it was an incredible relief when Detective Batten cleared her throat a moment later, ultimately tearing the attention of the FBI director away from her. Director Silver has joined us because our latest victim is FBI. Tally felt Sarah tense up beside her. She figured that given her experience and position, Sarah probably was close with quite a few people working for the agency. She knew what her partner was going to ask, and she knew how much she feared the answer she might receive. Who? Detective Batten was quick to reassure her. Nobody that we knew. Tally released a breath she didn't know she was holding, and she watched Sarah's shoulders drop almost instantly. As terrible as it may sound, but this was a relief. It was weird that the Camarilla killers seemed to have interrupted their personal vendetta against Sarah, but at least this would stop her from immediately blaming herself for this death yet again. Agent Cortez hadn't been with us for long. She was just out of the academy. It's very unfortunate, Silver continued without being asked to, his voice bare of any emotion, and apparently completely indifferent, that one of his agents had just been killed by a serial killer in cold blood. Look, I want to make one thing clear. The FBI is not looking at taking the case over and away from you. I believe that it's in more than capable hands with Detective Alder. Still, I want our departments to work closer together on this matter. I have already spoken with Captain Bellwether, and she has accepted my request that Detective Alder will personally keep me updated about any progress you make. I will stay in town for the next couple of days, just in case there will be any major developments, and I'm grateful for your cooperation on this. Judging the sour look on the captain's face, that request had been more of an explicit demand that didn't leave room for any discussion. Now this was just great. Next to Tally, Sarah had apparently come to the same conclusion, and only nodded tightly, wordlessly accepting her fate. Before things could get any more awkward, Tally spotted Scylla walking over to them. As usual, the coroner ignored Sarah completely, but her face lit up slightly when her eyes fell on Tally. She raised her hand in greeting, and Tally smiled at her warmly, but then noticed the way her brows furrowed slightly, as if she was in deep thoughts about something. "What's the matter?" Tally asked. "This one is weird." Suddenly, 5 heads turned in her direction, and Captain Bellwether hurried her to keep going. "Weird how?" "Something is different. When I first looked at the body, I thought the case was clear. Everything looked exactly like it always did. The stake, the burned body, the removed vocal cords. But, and I'm sorry if this sounds morbid, something about it felt different. I always sense a certain vibe in a dead body, and especially with serial killers, there is this signature. Small, minor details that tell me things about the killer, his attitude, and maybe even his behavior. With this body, something was off. So I took a closer look at it. The Camarilla killer had never killed fast. They weren't above letting their victims suffer a little, but they had always been effective and efficient. The cuts on the victim had been clean and precise, almost surgical, and they had never left much of a mess. With Miss Cortez over there, it's not exactly the same. It looks like the same weapon had been used, so whoever killed her must definitely have the knowledge only the Camarilla killer or someone very close to them had. Miss Cortez died quickly, probably almost immediately after the first cut. But the other cuts were messy. The wounds ripped at the edges, like the person had acted in a rush, or wasn't entirely sure what they were doing. The same goes for the way the victim had been tied to the stake. It had always been the same way. This time, though, the knot was different. I have no idea what to make of this, and we still haven't found any evidence at the scene. But I still want to let you know. "Thank you, Dr. Ramshorn," Captain Bellwether replied. Scylla nodded in response, and when she walked off again, the captain engaged Director Silver into another forced conversation on how the FBI and the Boston PD would approach the investigation, giving the other 3 women some time to process the new information on their own. Tally, Sarah, and Detective Batin remained silent for a moment, but while Tally appeared calm on the outside, her thoughts were racing. An unfamiliar victim, different cuts, different knots. The fact that Kara Brand was still in their custody. Other than Scylla, she knew exactly what to make out of this, and one look at Sarah and Detective Batin told her that they thought the exact same thing. Still, with Silver's shady ass still listening, nobody of them dared to put their thoughts into actual words. It was Tally who finally cleared her throat and tried to put together some hasty excuse. "So, actually, Detective Batin, Detective Alder, and I need to head back to the station for this thing." "Well done, Tally. How incredibly convincing." "Right. The interview you and Alder had scheduled. Also, there's going to be one hell of a press massacre coming our way, so someone has got to figure out the logistics." Detective Batin jumped to her rescue without even missing a beat. And with the sweetest smile directed at Director Silver, Sarah joined in. "I would love nothing more than to discuss this case with you in more detail, but as you can see, duty calls, so if you'll excuse us." She actually had the decency to flutter her eyelids apologetically. Captain Bellwether only frowned, visibly trying to hold back a chuckle, and apparently deciding to let things play out on their own. Silver, on the other hand, returned Sarah's smile immediately, once more seemingly oblivious to her reluctance. Then he stepped forward, right into her personal space, and placed his hand on her upper arm. From the outside, this might have appeared as nothing but a friendly gesture, but to Tally, it looked like a predator cornering its prey. only that Sarah Alder had absolutely no intention of becoming anybody's prey anytime soon. She immediately removed her arm, then returned Silver's gaze, cold and calculating. And finally, Silver averted his eyes slightly and stepped back. "Of course, detectives. Don't let me keep you. I'm looking very much forward to working so closely with you again." "What a curious thing to say, considering we are working on a murder case," Sarah replied dryly, then turned around and walked towards the car, Tally and Detective Patan right behind her. Sarah, 1, Director Silver, 0. They got into the car without speaking a word, Tally and Sarah in the front, Nick in her usual spot in the back seat. Only when Tally started the engine and the car was slowly rolling away from the crime scene, they broke their silence. "So I think it's about time we should invite Brother Dearest over for a little chat." Sarah finally spoke out what they had all been thinking. "Indeed," Detective Patan replied grimly. "Do you really think he is capable of killing someone?" "Tally, I believe people are capable of anything when it comes to protecting the people they love." Tally's heart jumped at Sarah's casual use of her first name, then sank at the realization that Detective Patan was in the car with them, and Tally could practically hear her smirk from the back seat. For now, however, the other detective remained silent. Sarah's words, though, were definitely true. The barkeeper seemed to be very close with his sister, maybe so close that he had known about her murderous hobby all along, had maybe even helped her kill the victims. Committing another murder when Kara was in police custody in order to make her appear innocent made sense, in a very sick way. "I guess you are right," Tally admitted. Then the three women fell silent again, until Detective Patan had apparently decided that her time to shine had finally come. "So, are we just going to ignore the elephant in the room?" "Yes," Tally and Alder replied in unison. "We are not going to talk about the fact that you two—" "No." "Or the massive hickey that has magically appeared on Craven's neck overnight? Absolutely not." This time, only Tally's shrill voice resonated through the car, while Sarah was biting her lip, trying to suppress a laugh. Tally's hands gripped onto the steering wheel a little tighter, and she felt her face heating up. That woman was unbelievable. Tally would make sure she would pay for that eventually. "Spoil sports," Detective Patan grumbled. "Anything else to share then? Thoughts? Questions? Come on, it's a long drive. Entertain me." "The drive is 20 minutes. My point still stands. You're a child." Tally chuckled quietly when she watched the playful banter between Sarah and Detective Patan. When she started working with them, they barely even managed to look at each other, and seeing them so relaxed together, joking around, was only showing her once more how far they all had come. Still, Tally had something on her mind, and now was probably as good a time as any. "I actually do have a question." "Oh, things are getting juicy. Now, Craven, what exactly can I help you with?" "Don't be shy. I have a lot of tricks up my sleeve," Patan teased, and Tally immediately blushed again. "No, goddess, it's nothing like that. It's about Director Silver." That seemed to do the trick, and the detective actually felt silent, ready to listen to Tally. "I mean, we all agree that the guy is shady as fuck. But apart from that, he seems so incredibly obsessed with Sarah. I mean, the way he looks at her is more than just borderline creepy. What's the deal with all that? I thought you only knew him from the time you investigated his daughter's death." "So she's Sarah now, huh? Not the point, Patan." Then it was actually Sarah who replied to Tally's question, releasing a quiet sigh. "I do, but apparently this was enough. He had made advances in the past. It started pretty much right after Penelope's case was assigned to me. He never tried anything serious, but still had made his interest in me pretty clear. In short, the guy couldn't take a hint, and he was completely oblivious to the fact that being a dick and having a dick are pretty much two of the biggest turnoffs for Sarah Alder," Nicta added dryly. "Touché," Sarah chuckled. Then her tone grew more serious again. "Seriously though, he asked me out a couple of times. I obviously declined, and the whole thing was over for me with that. But then when the second and the third murder happened, he was still trying to get in touch with me regularly. He always used his daughter as an excuse, and in the beginning, I actually felt sorry for him. But the more time passed, the more annoying it became. Fortunately, his career started to take off around that time. His attempts to contact me grew less frequent, and at some point stopped completely. I still believe he was totally keeping track of my work, considering how many times we accidentally crossed paths in court or at congresses. But I guess he's over me now, and even if he is not, it's definitely nothing I can't handle. Telly wasn't so sure about the first part of her last sentence, but decided to keep it to herself for now. Sarah's words only confirmed what she had already suspected. Something was really off with that man, and she would definitely need to pay close attention to every move he made. See, Red? Absolutely no need to be jealous. Sarah is all yours. Nikta, Alder snapped. Patan, Telly groaned at the same time. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.